For those of us who are just joining, who are online, this is the Environmental Justice Summit. We have put together an array of activities as well as events that have taken place over the last 2 days. So this is our second day, and we're going to continue on. Now, we talked about 3 specific areas that we wanted to address. We had a very excellent and robust open plenary, which in turn dealt with all of these issues on a very high level. We in turn had the corporate responsibility to come immediately right after that to talk about these issues. But now we're moving into looking and delving into the individual issues as addressed in our white paper for the Environmental Summit, Justice Summit. And one of those is health disparities. And so we have our health disparities panel, which will come before you now. We have a moderator who will introduce the actual panelists. We really appreciate that. We also want to thank our Summit Earth level sponsor, which is Clark Atlanta University, Institutional Advancement Division, and for our Summit partner level sponsor, in this case, which is Corporate Environmental Risk Management. Thank you so much. So again, this is the Health Disparities Panel.
So we would thank you all for coming out. We will get into the health disparities portion. I am Nija Dixon, a 4th-year student here at Clark Atlanta University in the dual degree engineering program, majoring in civil engineering and physics with a minor in political science. My goal is to work in sustainable design and architecture, as well as alternative renewable energy, to provide better housing for lower income and minority communities. And I will now introduce our distinguished guests and panelists. And so our first panelist is no stranger to CAU. We have Dr. Joanne B. Powell. She received her PhD from Meharry Medical College in biomedical sciences with an emphasis in pharmacology. She continued her training as a postdoctoral fellow at Emory University School of Medicine and the Winship Cancer Institute in the Department of Hematology and Oncology as part of the Fellowship in Research and Science Teaching Program. Dr. Powell joined Clark Atlanta University's Center for Cancer Research and Therapeutic Development in 2010. Her research aims to determine the role of environmental toxins in the aryl hydrocarbon receptor in the development of therapy-resistant cancers. Central to her work as an academic scientist is to help create opportunities to train the next generation of minority scientists. She pursues this goal as a member of the executive board of the FIRST program, a steering committee member of the Morehouse School of Medicine's Undergraduate Health Sciences Academy, and as a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated Physical and Mental Health Committee. Our next guest is Dr. Erica Holloman Hill, or as I like to call her, Dr. E. She earned her BS in Marine and Environmental Science, and an MS in Biology with concentration in Environmental Science from Hampton University. In January of 2012, she became the first African-American woman to attain a doctoral degree from the 2nd oldest college in the U.S., the College of William and Mary Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Dr. E's expertise lies in marine and climate science, environmental risk assessments, and environmental justice. In 2016, Dr. Holloman established AICA Solutions Incorporated. Currently, under her leadership, ASI is co-developing and managing the implementation of environmental justice program for their partner, the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance. So let's give a warm welcome to our panelists. And so why are we here today? It is said of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and inhumane. Public health is a powerful tool to level that playing field, to bend the arc of our country away from distrust and disparities and back towards equity and justice. And so I would like to ask our panelists to begin, in your professional opinion, why are these injustices occurring? And to help myself and other audience members understand the broader underlying root causes of health disparities within Black and brown communities.
So, good morning, and first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here as a basic scientist. It's nice to have this particular platform to speak and talk about the work that we do, and thank you for that introduction. So speaking of why these health disparities may persist, I think one of the reasons or root causes is that when we talk about environmental factors that affect health disparities or health outcomes, it's very difficult to pinpoint one particular event that leads to the health outcome, especially when you consider the amount of time that may happen between exposure to an environmental toxin and actual persistence or discovery of the disease, which is also a reason why we find it very difficult to hold those who may be responsible for introducing these toxins in our environment accountable. I think that is one particular reason that they continue to persist. Also, in these particular communities that we are often marginalized communities, there are a number of problems that need attention all at the same time, right? And so when you're talking about a health disparity or a health outcome that may have initiated years ago, it maybe did not receive the priority above other factors in the community. So if, for instance, your kitchen is on fire, you're not really going to be concerned about the leak in your roof, right? And so sometimes the event or the environmental event that occurs is somewhat divorced from the outcome or the health outcome that we can see years and years and years later.
Yeah. Hello? Yep. Great. And again, likewise, thank you, Naida, all of the organizers for allowing me to speak today and share just some thoughts around the disparities. And to your question, I think we have to have brave spaces to talk about the reality that race is still the driving and equitable variable. And with that, we know that race is a social construct. And so as we think about the various ways, and I'll just say as we define environment, it's not just the natural environment, right? It's also the built environment, the cultural environment, the social environment, the political environment, that all cumulatively come together to make up the whole of our community. And so understanding that it's not just a single model or the shift that we now see taking place, at least in EPA as it relates to understanding risk, moving from a single exposure assessment model to more of a cumulative, which is how we experience things in our everyday lives. I'm just thinking about the most recent environmental disaster that took place on Saturday here in Brunswick, Georgia, with the Pinova plant explosion, where I have family members who are now dealing with those long-term public health effects of being exposed. And so when we think about the disparities, race being that driving factor, race being a social construct, how is it that that social construct we've created now show up? It shows up where now your zip code is more of a predetermining factor than your own health genetic makeup. That's what we create now in this social environment. We heard the other panelists talk about policy. I love the political determinants of health. I am so excited to go down a rabbit hole that I didn't know existed. But for me, it places the responsibility and the accountability back on us, right? To rethink a new social structure and a social system, because the one that we have that's based on a non-biological reality, race is not real in a natural biological sense when we think about our humanity. But in this social construct, it's very real, and now it's having biological implications. And so for me, that root of a lot of the disparities is in how we have created this social construct that we have to revision, recreate, and implement something new.
And so as we talk about these different issues, I would like to ask how you guys are tackling some of them in your respective roles. So we can start with you, Dr. Powell.
So much like everything else, I think when you are approaching an issue, you have to attack it in a multifactorial way. And so you mentioned my joining here, the Center for Cancer Research and Therapeutic Development. That center has a health disparities component related to it where we are not only researching a disease that disproportionately affects African Americans, but we are also training the next generation of students who not only know how to combat and research that, but understand that it is a significant issue that we are facing now and one that we can have an impact on as well. In addition to that, we know that we can't just talk to each other, right? We can't just stay in our laboratories and stay in our offices. And although this is a wonderful forum in which we can discuss and plan and come out with a roadmap of what our next steps are, we also need to talk to the communities. I have been very privileged my entire life to be influenced by a number of HBCUs. And in every one in which I've had the opportunity to be a part of that community, we see it as a responsibility that our tentacles have to reach out into the community and bring them in with us in providing information and providing useful resources and information that they can actually use. What comes out of my laboratory may seem very disconnected from the community, but maybe I can influence the community by suggesting, let's have a meatless Monday. By my knowing that a lot of the toxins that my community is exposed to is through our diets, right? And that these toxins that we're talking about, the carbon metabolites, can live in the animals that we eat for up to 10 years. And so if I can propose something as attainable as a meatless Monday, that is one small factor that could have an effect.
Great.
Yeah, so in our work, understanding now that your zip code is kind of that driving factor, looking at the house. Outside of work, our home is where we spend a bulk of our time. And so you heard Gilbert talk about energy efficiency in this renewable energy wave. There's also the opportunity to address a lot of the hazards and health issues that are in our aging housing stock in this moment of what we are designing through, which will be a relaunch and a different perspective around the National Green Healthy Homes Initiative. We are looking to launch the Metro Atlanta Green Healthy Homes Initiative, where we're looking at the house as the model of addressing numerous public health issues, from asthma, from potential exposure to lead, by upgrading the house on their 8 factored list, where the 8th one is now energy efficiency. Like Gilbert mentioned, we have this opportunity to leapfrog our communities and build intergenerational wealth. So our research has looked at making sure our communities aren't left out of this net zero conversation, which is how do we ensure that those communities that are vulnerable, that are ours, aren't left holding this failing power grid, right? And the rate at which solar systems plus battery storage, and I'll say it again, plus battery storage, right, that allows you to be able to be off the grid, is happening at a greater rate in other communities, such that we are being left to hold this failing power grid system. And so in this program, not only are we looking to address the environmental hazards inside from the house, but also begin that process of energy efficiency and electrification of the homes that make it then solar ready, to then be able to talk about some of the other things, access to upfront cost capital and opportunities of accessing this $1 million moment through renewable. There has to be a space that's community owned and community driven. And so in here, we're working with legacy homeowners to actually create a community endowment fund that's connected to the AU to talk about that tentacle outreach and arm, where we hope to pilot through a purchase power agreement of particular solar generators that we have been ideating with community over the last 3 months with Microsoft, to talk about microgrids and what does that deployment of these potential generators could mean for residual income, and another way of using the home addressing energy efficiency, tapping into this renewable market to help to produce some of this intergenerational wealth that we know could happen by this renewable energy moment. And so a lot of our work, again, is like, how do we look at the home? And I say scaling down. We're so quick to scale up to look at things at a scaled up lens, and it's necessary, but so much of what we're really talking about happens at that individual level, and there needs to be enough folks too scaling down. And so with Wawa, several of the nonprofit partners, HBCU Green Fund, Energy Foundation, Partnership for Southern Equity, and others, we're working here to kind of address that.
And these are just such great points. I want to touch on something that you spoke to earlier, working with your cancer research. And it often comes in a lot of Black and brown communities. We are often used as, I'd say, guinea pigs in the medical field. And so it's hard to put trust in a system that has failed us. And so how can healthcare professionals regain the trust of Black and brown communities?
So this is an excellent question, and also one that is very, very dear to me. I grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama. And so I received a very early and forceful and hard education of what it is to live in a community that has a high mistrust of health professionals. I have watched, we tend to think of these events as being long ago, far, far ago, something, that we get to read about in our history books. But I have witnessed family members who are in the midst of a significant health event absolutely refuse and fight for their right to duke it out at home, simply because they do not trust that if they go into a hospital, they will ever come out. And that is a very difficult thing to watch as a child. And so that's kind of where my journey began, on how can we convince someone who has evidence of why they should mistrust that things are different. And I think where we begin is our own communities, right? So it's often said, who will save us? We must save ourselves, right? We must begin to educate ourselves. And one thing that has helped my community is seeing more doctors of color, to be present for them, to care for them. One initiative that happened when I was a little bit older is having these individuals to come into the community because they are a part of the community and not someone that we have to leave the community to visit, right? When we began to see them not just in the hospitals and clinics when we go there, but we see them in our churches. We see them at our community centers. We see them coming into our schools. They are our children's parents, or classmates and things like that. That builds trust outside of when you are experiencing a health event, right? So the trust has to be built before we are experiencing this emergency, and not just when we are in the midst of it.
And then I know, as an intern working with Wawa and some of the previous work that you've been doing with the midwifery and the Black maternal health, how's that been progressing as we talk about health disparities within the Black community?
As we just ended Black Maternal Health Week this past week, there is a great documentary. We actually had one of the screenings here in Atlanta, Birthing Justice is playing now on PBS. Atlanta has some of the highest mortality rates for mothers as it relates to our birth outcome. And it's sad to know that a lot of the reasoning behind that is just the shift and the medicalization of the birthing process, shifts from midwifery. We work with community midwives throughout Atlanta, specifically at Wawa, at the Outdoor Activity Center. We hold a space of about 12 foot by 4 foot, I don't know the exact dimensions, of raised beds, where we are calling these beds that are for the wombs of Black women. They're midwives, they're doulas, and giving Black women a brave and safe space to come place their hands in dirt, be out in nature, grow the fresh fruits and vegetables needed to help not only their family, but throughout the duration of their pregnancy. Some of the midwives are having the opportunity of growing some of the herbs that they could use during the birthing and post-birthing process. And so it's really been an opportunity of leveraging this planet, this natured space that still does give us an opportunity to de-stress, right? I think stress and race are really connected. Stress shows up as stress hormones when we think about being chronically always stressed and how that then has a play on making us more susceptible then to disease. How do we de-stress? What are these ways? And so we've created this outdoor space that not only allows us to grow, but allows us the space to commune and communicate to one another. And so that's one way that we've been addressing head on, at least the maternal birthing crisis here in Atlanta from a bottom-up approach.
So I'd like to ask, what are some other initiatives that you have found to be successful in tackling some of these issues?
The health disparities.
Yes.
I think one of the most undervalued, or maybe not talked about as much, is having representation on particular panels and boards where these decisions are made. So when we think a lot about the actual environment, or why we are talking about landfills being found particularly in these marginalized communities, those decisions about where to place a landfill are often made without any input from the community. And even by the time the community learns of these plans, it's already too late. Dr. Bullitt has been mentioned a few times this morning already. And I had the privilege very early on when I arrived at Meharry. One of the things that was occurring was the Holt family, who lived in Dixon, Tennessee at the time, were just starting to undergo their fight for environmental justice. And if you are not familiar with Dixon, Tennessee, it is a small town that is, despite what the story you hear, you may think there are a lot of African Americans there. It is a highly predominantly white county. Only about 5% of that county is African American. Yet, the only place they could think to place this landfill was where that 5% of African Americans lived. And for 40 years, waste came from all the surrounding cities, from Nashville and everywhere around, and was dumped in this African American community. And it took members of that community, particularly the Holt family, when they began to recognize so many of us are now being diagnosed with cancer. My father, my mother, myself, and the same thing with our neighbors. And where did they go? They reached out to our HBCUs. They spoke to individuals like Dr. Bullitt, who became an advocate for them. They came down to Meharry to ask us to come in as scientists and began to take samples and prove that they were indeed being poisoned by their water, right? And so now we have moved to a point where we have representation at the EPA that we saw today, where when they are building these panels, I was invited to be on the EPA Scientific Advisory Board Chemical Assessment because of that, because there are individuals who will now embrace the diversity and make sure that we have a seat at the table so that we can then advocate for our communities. We're just beginning. Representation still needs to grow, but I think that that is an important factor and point, that the things we see behind the scenes that are the things that we don't see that are happening behind the scenes have a really, really high impact on our communities.
Dr. E, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, as you talked about the importance of the HBCUs, we can't stress how important it is for us to stay connected. The HBCUs themselves represent the institution that is not going anywhere. Oftentimes, the professors themselves are part of that institution that's not going anywhere. So you're able to be become that stake in the ground that community can trust, right? Because the institution has not gone anywhere. It gives the opportunity for students who become transient to learn from surrounding community members that are as institutionalized as the institution itself, to be able to address these issues that we see in our African American communities across the country. The reason why I'm saying this in this particular moment, going back to what's been highlighted about this $1 trillion moment, we have other academic institutions, such as Georgia Tech, such as Emory, great institutions. However, the rate at which they are researching in our own communities, and we talk about this information of data. It's our lived experiences that are showing up in these data points, and at the level that it gets aggregated, and now we're able to say something about a census tract, say something about a city. When you scale down, that goes to your individualized data point, your individualized data point. And in this moment where we are collecting data, our HBCUs need to get into the data collection and data ownership of this information, because the vulnerability of our community is now the economic driving factor of the moment. Even down when we look from Justice 40 and the distribution of funding going down to disinvested communities. We already know we don't need to do no more mapping. We need to move straight to implementation and partnering with our HBCUs. I am really excited. My mother was a 1968 graduate of Clark College back then, and so as I was walking in, I have a picture of my mom with her cap and gown standing kind of in the shared grass space. And so memories that weren't even mine to have, but I remember the stories being told about how important it is for us to stay connected. When we talk about brain drains, right? Innovation in this moment is leapfrogging on the ground. That innovation is being taken out through our IP as other academic institutions and others are coming to partner and work with us. And then ideas and things leave our community and we have to pay for it to come back. So how do we stop really the intellectual piracy of our community by working directly with our HBCUs, particularly in this moment around energy burden, renewable energy, transportation, climate change, the list goes on. How do we make sure that communities that are surrounding our institutions that are not going anywhere to be active in applied scientific research, not just research to add to the brick wall of knowledge, but application of the information.
And so you both emphasized the purpose of connecting with our HBCUs, and we have some students in the room, so that's to wrap up. How would you all suggest us getting involved and becoming more aware of these issues?
I would think, and I often say to my students, speak up. What you say matters. What you think, you are going to be the ones who are bringing on the new ideas, right? The innovation will come from you. And you know, I grew up with the notion of education was the passport to the future, but I also believe it's going to be the protector of the future, right? Because the strides that we make now, the things that we are able to advance now, will need to be protected. Progress is slow, but there are also barriers to maintaining that progress. And we are going to need the next generation to be there, not only to advance further, but to protect any gains that are made now. And I think that that is very important, being able to be a part of the community instead of what you mentioned really touched home, because often we will have investigators who come into our community to study us, right? And a lot of the questions that they will ask and the outcomes that come from that leave out particular factors because they're just not aware of of how these factors play into us. When we're talking particularly about my focus of environmental toxins, it's often missed that, yes, we can talk about how they are introduced, but my community has a high increase or high tendency to embrace a soul food diet, right? And so now when we're talking about these toxins and we know that these metabolites are increased in foods that we fry, that is something that someone who is not aware of how our daily diets may be in terms of preparation could miss. So, you know, staying involved with the community, not just when we need something from the community, is also going to be very important.
Dr. E, any last thoughts?
Call. It's a call of action on behalf of community members in Brunswick, Georgia. Dr. Yomi, unfortunately, was not able to sit on this panel today with Eco Action. There's some discrepancy in community story and the story that's being placed out about the Pinova plant explosion that took place in Brunswick, Georgia. If you are not familiar, Brunswick is the dirtiest city in Georgia with the most Superfund sites. This plant changed owners in 2010, but the site itself is 100+ years old. It's the old Hercules power plant, Hercules industrial facility. There's active work going on right now, but the call of action is for the AUC, for all of the scientific researchers that understand environmental toxic exposure, environmental risk assessment for what this long-term exposure means. We need help. Please reach out to Dr. Yomi of Eco Action. You can reach out to myself, Dr. Erica Holloman-Hill. If you are interested in supporting the on-the-ground actions that is taking place right now in response to this. And I say in terms, you heard Dr. Joke say, climate change is here, it's happening now. Some of the things we think about in our coastal regions, emergency response, right? What does that mean in Atlanta as now we have new tornado paths coming through areas of the city that we never did before? How are we preparing for that? I remember we used to have tornado drills when I was a little girl here in Atlanta growing up. We don't do that anymore. So emergency preparation, and going back to the Pinova plant, our community in Brunswick, they need you. We need this institution to come and support and rally, not only for that one plant, but for the rest of the environmental areas for Georgia. And I think that will be the last words that I leave. Let's connect the AU to every environmental justice community in the state of Georgia.
And can we just give them both another round of applause for this great dialogue and conversation? And so now we will open the floor to maybe one or two questions from any audience members.
While we are waiting for that other question, I had so many thoughts and questions that I wanted to ask, but I'm going to wrap it up into one question. Dr. E addressed stress, and a thing that is on the minds of my students a lot is mental health. And so I was hoping that you could address mental health in terms of not just the weathering effects and cumulative impact of stress, but even the hope or despair related to climate change and our environments. And then also, the other thing I wanted to ask was about behavior change. So you cited some facts and statistics, but getting people to stop eating meat just one day a week is a challenge. Or now we hear a lot of chatter about gas stoves and the toxins that they emit. And when you talk to people about electrifying their cooking, they are not ready to give up those gas stoves. So mental health, behavior. Can you, either of you address those?
I'm going to address the behavior perspective from a very personal piece. And I think, you know, when we think about the change, we say it starts with you, but it really does, right? And I think about my own habits, some that are not serving me nor the planet, but nonetheless they are still a habit that even with information, it takes commitment, but then to resources, right? And so when we think about vulnerability in our community, behavior and the changes that it takes to have to make that, so much of the emphasis falls on the individual having to do that, right? But I think sometimes we forget it still take resources, and I'm not necessarily always talking about the financial resources. Sometimes it's just the support to say, hey girl, you know it's Monday, don't eat that meat today, right? But we have to be willing to put those systems into place for ourselves and be our own safety nets. I think somewhere during the desegregation of our communities, we lost the opportunity and the ability to self-define, self-create, protect, and be able to determine a future for ourselves. And I think we have the opportunity, as we think about where will our HBCUs play, what role will they play in the coming future, becomes critical.
I think we had another question.
Yes, we actually have 2 more questions. I'm going to get both of these questions and then let the panelists respond.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Walter Brock, Director of Development, Institutional Advancement here at Clark Atlanta University. Thank you all so much for the conversation. You all were able to take some big items and issues and kind of break them down in a relatable way. So that's kind of my question. How do we normalize these conversations? Because sometimes I think in our communities, some of this information may be hard to digest or hard to understand or hard to access. When you see a lot of social causes or people who are championing them, whether it's people in our communities, entertainers, athletes, sometimes this piece in terms of the environmental side of it we don't always lead with that, right? So what are some ways that we can normalize these conversations, and how does marketing and communications around these issues matter, and how can we enhance that, if that makes sense?
So I think along the lines of something I mentioned earlier, which was to be there when we don't need something, when we're not engaged in a study. On a personal note, my father began smoking, I understand, when he was 15 years old. And for the next 20 years until I came along, he continued to smoke. The one thing that gave him the inner strength to say, I'm going to stop, is a child asking him to, his child asking him to, right? And so one way that we are trying to talk to the community about our diets and how we could make small incremental changes, right? Because you can't come in and just say, hey, don't fry that chicken on Sunday, right? Is talking to the kids. So we'll have what is called Saturday Academy. We don't need anything. We're just coming in, talking, having some fun, and we'll start introducing fruits and vegetables that may not be common to them on an everyday basis. And using that to say, how do we prepare them? Like break out a kitchen there, and they're having so much fun, and they go home. One of them said to me a few weeks after we had talked about eggplant, which she had never seen or had before our Saturday Academy, and she was an elementary school student, that, hey, the eggplants that we took home, I made them for my family, and they loved them, right? And so that was a way that we could influence diet without having to even speak directly to the decision maker in there. Because we all know that a child can get us to move in ways and can motivate us in ways that many other things cannot. So I think not if we don't overlook that aspect of our community, and that we are often motivated by the possibility of creating a better future for our own children, that can be a really powerful factor.
We just have one last question here.
I don't have a question. I have a couple of comments, and thank you to the panel for this engaging discussion. So, I also do research on health disparities. In fact, our lab was the first one to start health disparities research here at Clark Atlanta. So, we study the genetics of health disparities in African Americans. And what I want to, get you guys thinking is that genetics also plays a big role. So if we put together on a triangle, the genetics, the environment, and the social, how do we cross-sect these things? And how can we develop strategies to develop or develop early intervention strategies to figure out who is at most risk. So I think that is something I want all of us to start thinking, where we are going. My second comment is, you guys said climate change, and that got me thinking. If we figure out that, research says that the average temperature is going to increase by 0.5 degrees or 1 degrees by 2030 or whatnot, just think about the Earth as an incubator. All those dumping grounds, waste dumping grounds are now going to have a temperature of 1 degree higher. They are going to release toxins because that's an incubator. That's how fast all those toxins are going to get, and you're going to get exposed. So how do we develop to minimize that impact? We cannot underestimate the impact of that climate change on our, on the population that we are talking about. So just a food for thought, and I think it has a great potential, and we should start thinking and addressing these now. Otherwise, it's going to be too late. Thank you.
And I think Morehouse School of Medicine has just opened up a new center for climate and health, looking at that intersection between environment and health. And again, it's so important that our HBCUs are actively engaged in this on behalf of our communities.
Yes. And so I would like to thank you both again for your commitment to this program and your continued work in the field. And we will now transition into our lunch portion. And so we'll give you all a chance to take a break, continue to network, and look forward to our next panel discussion. Thank you.